All right, good afternoon, everybody. I am Joanne Manieri with RXR Realty, and I think I have the final panel today. It's an exciting group of panelists. Each of them have shaped our skylines and have transformed communities during their careers and are still doing it. So I'm going to do a quick intro to welcome our panelists. First, we have Melissa Birch. She is the Executive General Manager for the Lend-Lease Americas development business. She is responsible for leading and growing the development platform and oversees the acquisition and development, design, financing, construction, as well as the sales and marketing for projects such as 277 Fifth Avenue, a 55-story, 600 tall, and she'll talk more about it later, residential tower opening this year. Kate Bicknell, the head of New York development for Oxford Properties. She is responsible for building the region's development platform for Oxford, starting with St. John's Terminal, a 1.3 million square foot redevelopment site. Welcome, Kate. And we have Rebecca DeLoya, Senior Vice President, RXR Realty, overseeing a master plan at Garvey's Point in Glen Cove, Long Island, which is a mixed-use project which will include residential condominiums, multifamily rental properties, retail, as well as new public spaces. She is also leading the master planning for the Nassau Hub, which will activate the 66 acres surrounding the Nassau Coliseum. And we have Meg Broad, a Senior Vice President and Regional Development Officer for the Rockefeller Group. She is overseeing condominium projects on the Upper East Side, Nomad, as well as mixed-use project in Hoboken, New Jersey. Welcome, everyone. I had the pleasure of working with three of our panelists here for many, many years, and I'm thrilled to have them here today. You know, many companies and institutions, and you heard today, are raising money and investing billions of dollars in real estate. And ground-up development has become a key line of business. Investors, you heard earlier today, want to get closer to their projects. So I thought we could begin by discussing the dynamic career path of real estate development, because many of us don't start in the field. We come from different professional backgrounds. So let's hear how each of these panelists began their career. So how did you get involved in real estate? We'll start off with Kate Bicknell.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. So as Joanne mentioned, I'm a... Hello? Yeah. Does that work? Okay, fantastic. Kate Bicknell with Oxford. I actually started my career in the U.S. Senate, actually, working for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I had a bit of an unusual start. I did undergrad in urban and regional studies with a focus on urban issues and redevelopment of cities. And when I had the opportunity to work for the senator, it was an incredible opportunity. And as he retired, I worked as a legislative essentially director for a nonprofit in DC focused on the revitalization of cities, so transportation, economic development, housing, et cetera. And as I went through that process, which was an incredible process, looking at vacant properties, transformations, et cetera, I kind of got tired of doing the policy side of development and really wanted to be in the heart of the matter and doing of development. So I ended up at that point in time actually making a switch, going to business school, and actually while I was at business school, I met Marion Gilmartin, who was the former CEO at Forest City, and actually met Joanne there at Warren as well, and had a chance to work with Rebecca and Melissa at Forest City, working initially on Barclay Center, and then on the new Cornell Tech campus, and then about 5 months ago, I joined Oxford to help build their New York development team.
That's great. Okay. Melissa?
Great. Hi, everyone. So, I think there's probably no conventional path to get into development, so I'll be interested to know if there's any similarities here. I am a government major in undergrad, and I also have my MBA, which in and of itself might be two ingredients, that you probably often find in development. I will say that I got started post-undergrad in investment banking, and in many ways, my first love in the business world is, I enjoy deals. I like originating work. I really enjoy the capitalization of projects, that sort of moment. But I have always been fascinated, and what really drew me into real estate is this sort of intersection of the private and the public sector. When I was in investment banking, as much as I enjoyed, interacting with the capital markets, I really missed the sort of broader thinking about cities and about how we have a role in transforming those cities, and always felt that real estate is at the intersection of that gray space between business and government. So I went to business school, and my internship when I was at Harvard Business School, I had reached out to a pretty unknown, to be honest, developer at the time named Bruce Ratner, which is sort of hard to imagine that, that he at one point in time was unknown. But, for a while the firm was, and this is Forest City Ratner Companies, was this, Brooklyn-based development shop before Brooklyn was the phenomenon that Brooklyn is today. And what had originally drew me to reach out to the firm is that they were one of the few firms really undertaking true public-private development partnerships. And having this interest in government, having this interest in, in business, I felt like this is really the right firm. Like, this is such an unusual creature. Of course, that's not the case today, because there are quite a number of people playing in the public-private development partnership space, but then it was quite distinct. So I am ever grateful to Bruce, Joanne, others for giving me a shot. I think at the time, since I knew no one in real estate development, I was born in Ohio, and so was Bruce. Bruce went to Harvard undergrad, and I went to Harvard undergrad, and I thought that maybe was enough to be like, we have so much in common. So a summer internship led to a full-time job, and that's another theme that I have in my life, which is I really was a cold call. And so I have tried to be open. Don't people start cold calling me right now, but I have been open-minded to cold calls, because real estate is a bit of who do you know kind of a game. And of course, you've got to develop those networks, but I really got my start knowing no one. And just jumping into the game, working hard. Spent 12 years at Forest City, ultimately ran the commercial and residential development business for Forest City. When Marianne was tapped to become CEO, she tapped me to be her successor, which was a tremendous opportunity for me to work with and alongside many of the colleagues here at this table, leading some of the best, some of the largest projects like Atlantic Yards, Cornell Tech, and others that were really shaping the landscape of the city. 3.5 years ago, I decided to leave Forest City and join Lend-Lease, who is a global development company headquartered out of Sydney, Australia. They have a $60 billion development pipeline, and all of it at that point in time was outside of the US. And they were looking for a head to help them initiate their development business in New York and throughout the US. So I've now been at the helm of this market, building and creating their development platform here. And it's all about evolution, Joanne, you're totally right. And this evolution is certainly distinct from the previous ones in terms of helping a global business integrate into a local market, and also more of a construction-based business. Lend-Lease has a huge construction platform here in New York, help them transform to thinking about originating business on the development side and owning and developing projects in their own right.
Thank you, Melissa. Meg?
Yeah, so I also have an unusual sort of path to development as well, but I felt like I was sort of born with an interest in real estate from early on. I grew up in Japan, but there was kind of an equivalent to Sunday Times, and I was that weird kid that would pick that up at age 10 or something, and would be pitching deals to my father as to which houses he should buy. And when I noticed that there was a listing that was cheaper, he pointed out that it was on a ground lease, and then that's when I learned that ground leases trade for a discount. And so I was sort of doing the math of like what kind of discounts they traded. So anyway, I felt like I had this innate interest in real estate. But fast forward, I went to college. I went to Duke University, and I was an economics major. And development is a kind of a difficult place to just kind of enter into. Even if you're interested in real estate, it's very hard to find a development position right out of college. And with my economics major, I kind of went into finance because it was sort of what I felt I was good at. And I joined JP Morgan and did that for a couple of years, and then realized very quickly that it wasn't really what I was interested in. I really did want to do real estate. So I also went to business school, somewhat of a parallel path, actually knew Melissa Birch at Harvard Business School. And that's when I made the transition. And actually, much like her, instead of Bruce Ratner, I called Tom Pritzker, cold called Tom Pritzker. So maybe they taught us something at Harvard Business School at the time of just calling people that we wanted to work for. So that phone call, which I was just shocked that somebody like that would pick up the phone, but his assistant picked it up and he called me the next day and offered me a summer internship. And it was in DC for Pritzker Residential, and I wanted to do hotel development, but I was like, hey, this is pretty good. I took that internship, which led to a job eventually, not immediately for them, but for another job here in New York for Tishman Speyer. So I did what they called like a leadership development program where I rotated around, did everything from property management to D&C, which is design and construction. I did portfolio management, and then eventually I ended up in the development group at Tishman Speyer. After that, my connection to Pritzker Residential is that my boss at the time for my summer internship actually started a development group for equity residential when Pritzker Residential sort of sold, or when the Pritzkers had a family feud and they kind of divested all of their businesses. Some of the people that were there went off to Equity Residential, started this new development group within Equity, and then invited me to join him to lead the New York development group. So that was a big opportunity, and I obviously jumped at it. I grew Equity's development pipeline, and then that led me to where I am today, which is at the Rockefeller Group. So I run their Northeast Development Group. We have many condos as well as industrial sites in New Jersey and across the country, as well as some core office holdings. But my focus right now is on development. That's been my journey.
And Rebecca?
So I don't think I really thought at the beginning that I would be doing real estate development. My first job out of college was with the Parks Department. I was actually responsible for all of the licenses for the hot dog carts in Flushing Meadow Park, which goes into the category of, I don't think my parents sent me to Cornell to do that, but anyway. It was about a title. My title there was project manager. And what I learned about being a project manager is that you don't necessarily need to know everything that you're supposed to do, you just need to do it. And you're sort of responsible you're the person who needs to have the answer to the questions or know the people to ask to get the questions. So I worked for the Parks Department for 3 years and knew I needed to move on, took my LSATs, thought maybe I'd go to law school, maybe MBA, and then realized that actually I just wanted a new job. And I had read in the category of cold calling, I read in the paper that Lincoln Center had gotten a huge grant from an anonymous donor to jumpstart the redevelopment of the campus on the Upper West Side. And a friend of mine said, you should just write to them because you really like the opera, you're kind of artsy, why don't you just see if they got a bunch of money, maybe they need some help. So I did, and Rebecca Robertson, who was heading up the project, who was an amazing early mentor of mine, said, I think you could do this. I was also coming out of the Parks Department in the late 90s, so I was cheap talent, certainly priced for the nonprofit world. And so it worked out, but I worked with Rebecca and the small nonprofit on the master planning of the entire campus, and we got into all the design. We had to submit a master plan to the city, and I knew some contacts from the city because I had just come from there. And the amazing thing about it was that we were working with Frank Gehry and his team, and we were doing, I had sort of access to this unbelievable architectural bench and people who were thinking about reimagining this space that was very historic, but I really had, in terms of like the heart of the arts world, really, and also such an important part of New York, but had been constructed to to really keep out the community, quite literally with walls on Amsterdam Avenue and on 65th Street. The idea that I was part of a team that was going to blow that open and reposition it for the city was really exciting. But we got to the point where we needed to start construction, and Rebecca, in a moment of mentorship, said, you can learn all about construction and stay here for the next couple of years, or you can go meet someone I know who's working on another big project in Brooklyn. It's called Atlantic Yards. And so with that, I went and met with the folks at Forest City and made the jump from nonprofit to private sector. And that was really about the project, because it wasn't so much that I suddenly wanted to go into the private sector or change those things. It was just another amazing transformational project in a part of New York that I could be a part of from the very beginning. 12 years later, I was there, overlapped with Kate and Melissa, and we were in the trenches together, I would say. Went through all the entitlement process there, a massive EIS, a general project plan, a complete rezoning and rewriting of the zoning code of 22 acres with Amanda Burden, which was an amazing experience. Amazing being a funny word, but it was an experience. And then got to actually touch the construction side, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit in some of the questions. But at Forest City, there was a real collaboration between construction and the development team. And so when it came to building Barclays Center, it wasn't a handoff to the construction team. It was such a knotty building. There were so many end users that needed to be incorporated into the design that we really worked hand in hand through that. So I actually got to learn the construction business there. And I would say it was a great path because it led me to another round building called the Nassau Coliseum, which happens to be on Long Island, where I'm from. And after that building opened, and there was an opportunity to join RXR, who is obviously one of the major players in New York real estate, but the only company that I saw that was doing the type of transformational development in the Long Island space, which for my life and for my maybe distaste or tiring of the Long Island Railroad made a lot of sense to be working on these projects in a 10-mile radius of my home. So that's how I got here.
That's great. That's great. That could lead us into the next question, which is, let's hear really some details about the development process. Does it differ for each asset class? And tell us a little bit about in your description some of the transformative projects you've worked on. And why don't we'll start off with Meg, okay?
Sure. So I'll take a couple of those parts.
Okay.
I would say one of the biggest differences that I've noticed between asset classes is, for example, residential, which is probably the area that I have the most experience, is it's really down to the minor details, right? You have to care about the details. You have to have the mindset of the end user in mind, whether it's a rental or a condominium. And we're talking about the colors of your doorknobs, or where to place these like a junction box, or everything needs to be decided. Whereas for industrial projects, I mean, and by the way, residential, the amount of detail that goes into, for example, like a 100-unit condo building is enormous, and it takes years for the whole design process and obviously the development to be completed. Whereas industrial, it's a lot more about actually entitlement and getting the land in the area that is desirable, and going through perhaps the toughest thing is environmental cleanups, for example, because we're talking about large tracts of land, but the actual design and the building of it, you can do in a matter of like a year, like 10 months, you're done. So it's just 4 walls, a roof, and then really obviously the inside of it is being outfitted by the end user, whether it's Amazon or FedEx Ground or whoever. So other than thinking about how many loading bays you need and how much parking space you need and maybe the square footage of the box, that's really all that you're talking about. So there's quite a big difference between something like that versus something like residential. And then in terms of the location of these developments, the project that I have in Hoboken versus a project that for example, that I have in Nomad it's rather kind of night and day when you think about the actual the government process. So the Nomad project, it was an as-of-right development. So of course you have to go to DOB and file your plans and follow up on all of the objections and so forth. But we know that we are allowed to build residential on this plot of land, and I know what the setbacks needs to be. I know that there's no height restriction. There's a lot of things that I can work with on day one. Whereas in Hoboken, I still don't know what I'm able to build. So I have 3 large tracts of land, and we're going through a redevelopment plan process. And after the redevelopment plan process, which is, again, it's not really up to me, it's up to the community, it's up to the mayor, it's up to a whole lot of people. I don't even control the timeline of how long that takes. We're hopeful that it will be, done in a matter of perhaps 12 to 18 months, but that's sort of up in the air. And then once that gets done, there's a redevelopment agreement that needs to be negotiated, and that agreement with the city also is like a very long lead time item where you are dependent on the city. There are lots of sort of very case-by-case situations in terms of how much affordable they want, and if you give them more, they'll give you X square foot more. There's just a lot of negotiations that happen on a parcel-by-parcel basis. So that needs to get done. And then you need to submit your site plan and make sure that the site plan conforms to the agreement, and then they get to review that as well. And they can take as much time, not as much time, but there's a lot of leeway in terms of how much time they can take. So those are kind of the New York City.
Excited about the project through that whole
process.
process.
We have to stay excited about
There's a lot of dynamics going on.
You have to be a good neighbor through the whole process. You have to love, you have to love everybody and everything that the city's doing and their initiatives. And you really do have to think about, for example, in Hoboken in particular, they're really worried about flooding right after Hurricane Sandy and so forth. The city was really struggling with water. Flooding, and so those are some of the things that we know they care about. There's obviously a whole lot of things that a city would care about, but factoring in all of those things, it's just a very different process than what we would do, for example, in a condominium development in Nomad. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Melissa, you want to share one?
Sure. I always think of each development, it's distinct, it's like its own individual person, or I sort of think of it as its own company, because it really is. Every single development has its own capital partners, has its own end user, has its own consultant team. So there isn't really, while there's sort of a development process that maybe has some, rhymes across all of the different types of projects that I've worked on, it's part of, I think, being great at the development game is being able to really assess sort of the unique potential of each site and trying to figure out what that is. It's not a formula. Each site is really different. That really starts for me. I'm a big believer in picking the right team. And what I mean by that is who you select as your architect, who you select as your key consultants. These are critical choices that you make in putting together a project. The developer doesn't have all of the answers. The developer, in many ways, is sort of the ultimate generalist of the project. The person's the quarterback. They're the CEO of that company. But part of that is that you're not really across every last detail. You're really relying on a lot of different types of experts to help inform your decision making about how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. And as the developer, you're really responsible for figuring out how do all those pieces fit together? Which pieces can I sort of leave off the puzzle right now because I don't want to lock them into place? I want to keep that flexibility. I'm not ready to nail down that decision yet. And so the process, I don't think you need to be sort of a residential specialist or a commercial specialist. I've really enjoyed sort of developing across all the different asset classes, and in particular, really love mixed use projects, vertical mixed use projects, because we're in New York and land is scarce. So, you really have to think about vertical villages versus, horizontal precincts. I sort of think about it in that, in that vein. And then ultimately, I think that Meg's point about as of right versus entitlement is really interesting because in New York, we're really driven predominantly by as of right sort of dominates the market. That said, every single person up here has probably participated intensively in entitlement processes. But that's really different as you venture outside of New York. One of the unique assets of the city is this, as of right development, which really dictates a lot of how land gets traded, et cetera. So for me, working just to bring this back for a moment, I work for an international firm. I've really had to appreciate how distinct development is across all the cities of the US and then of course globally. And a lot of that comes back to entitlements. I've had to spend quite a bit of time in the early days of my role launching the New York business, really sort of demystifying this market for our investment committee. And as such, the development process and where we think about where we're willing to take on risk in that development equation is different because the markets are set up from such a different perspective in terms of when you're able to secure your offering plan and start selling condominiums in and of itself is something that is done very differently in the different markets, and you can de-risk that part of the project at a very different stage if you're developing in Sydney, Australia, or in Boston than if you're developing in New York.
Got it. Thank you. So, you all have experience in developing in different areas, some urban, some suburban. What are the differences? What are the similarities? So, Rebecca, let's try you.
So I in my career made a big change actually from working only in the city realm to getting my hands around Long Island, even though I was born and raised there. I really didn't have any sense of how the land use process worked. And as the process that Meg described, I'm sort of furiously nodding next to her because it's definitely the truth of it. And I think the not having the as of right, and I can remember the first day that we spoke to the land use council that we brought on when I was at Forest City and we were going to do the Nassau Coliseum project. We brought in local land use council because it was advised to us that that's what we should do. And the first thing they said is just there's no as of right. It's site plan. You have to go through the site plan. And understanding that the consultant team that you hire out in the suburbs, or particularly in Long Island where I've been working, is, it's about their engineering depth, the depth of bench and the design work they can do, but a lot of it has to do with the relationships that they have with the agencies, because there are people that are, that want the project to succeed. They certainly want to give you the permits and the approvals that you need, but you have to be working with the right type of people who can present that information to them in a way that works for them. And so I think having worked in New York, we all know the players that we work with, and I'm sure we can all say, even at all the different companies that we've worked at, sometimes you walk into your first day at a new company and it's the same lawyer across the table, they're just representing, Oxford or Lend-Lease, and that's true on Long Island as well. It's just, I would say that part is definitely different and sometimes harder, and then it's just, in the suburbs, I think sometimes you need to get over the benchmark of development and density, which is something that we're dealing a lot with, obviously in Glen Cove and in Nassau, at the Nassau hub. In New York, people are they understand that there's cranes on their streets and that there's street closures and that there's construction all around them, and that is still a difficult thing, I think, to bring the suburban public, to get them comfortable with, and it's a hurdle that you have to get over before you even get to the talking about the project.
Okay. Kate, you want to touch base on that?
Yeah, I think most of my experience has been urban. And I think if you can pull the two questions together, I think for sure some of the biggest differences really do relate to, is it a public-private partnership? Is it right? Is it as of right? And also I think scale plays in as well. And I think that the density piece, obviously, and the suburban versus urban, I think one of the things that's really interesting as it relates to both whether it's as of right or whether it is, for example, a public-private partnership, I think some of the things that really are interesting and create opportunities that I think has been really unique to hear among several of us is what brought us all to development. And it's that act of creating in a way where you have the ability to have an impact on the city that can be transformational. And I think whether it be, Melissa talking about the relationship between government, economics, and really how can we affect the space, or Rebecca talking about Lincoln Center. I think what we have the potential to do, and what where you have differentiators, is really the scale of the projects that you're doing. And one of the projects that coming to Oxford that we're have just recently announced is the redevelopment, and I know that Hillary Spann mentioned earlier, of the redevelopment of St. John's Terminal, which is in Hudson Square, which is one of those. It's actually a bit of an anomaly because it is something that is as of right, but it is of a scale, and it really creates some of those opportunities. So I think some of those also relate to speed, right? The as of right, but it also sometimes when you have the public with you as well, and it is a public priority, then there's an ability to work with the government agencies to expedite certain pieces through. So I think those scale and public-private versus as of right are some of the things that help on the differentiation, say, that apply both urban and suburban.
Okay, thanks. So, when we all got together to discuss the panel, Melissa was kind enough to take us on a site tour of her project. So, Melissa, let's hear a little bit about
Sure.
your asset.
Thanks, Joanne. Yeah, I took everyone right to the 55th floor penthouse to take in the vistas from our development at 277 Fifth Avenue. This project, I'll tell you, is the first as-of-right project I've ever done. So it's a 6-lot assemblage, air rights transfer, and an inclusionary housing bonus to create 260,000 gross square feet of residential development. We're developing a condominium high-rise on the corner of 5th Avenue and 30th Street. It's 55 stories. It's the tallest residential condominium on 5th Avenue, like 1 foot taller than the Trump Tower.
On purpose. You did that on purpose.
On purpose. With a big, chunky retail podium in the base. So being on 5th Avenue, despite all the bad headlines about retail, we do think there's a really transformational retail development opportunity that we're planning for at the base of that building. We brought in Raphael Vignoli of 432 Park Avenue fame. This is his sort of next major condominium design, on one of the great avenues in New York. The building is an exoskeleton, so all of the superstructure is pulled out to the edges of the building, which means that all of the interiors are column-free. So we really are able to get, to sort of use the fact that we're developing on a postage stamp to our advantage, which is to get all of the structure out of the way to allow for floor plans that really flow seamlessly. We brought on Jeffrey Beers International to work with us in developing all of our interiors to give them that nice residential sensibility. And you see, this very stark expression of Vignoli's design with these sort of vertical, I call them the vertical ribbons of concrete that run up the side of the building, which is that superstructure pulled to the outside of the frame. And then spiraling down from the top of the building are a series of loggias, which are sort of cutouts in the volume that give a sort of signature element of design at the very top of the building. So these loggias are really double height outdoor spaces, which are pretty unique. In high-rise development, it's really hard to get access to outdoor space at the top of the building, and to do that in a way where it feels an extension of your home and not like you're hanging out on a balcony over New York, because that doesn't feel comfortable at all. So these loggias have been incredibly well received in the marketplace. I've found in developing this project that you have to be a real product specialist, and part of that is really understanding your end user, as Meg mentioned, about what it takes to develop and design a condominium, is really understanding who you are creating this for and what attributes they are going to prize. We have found anything that is unique or a one-off in our building has had excellent sell-through. We've had some very high price per square foot achieved in this building, really setting new high water marks for this burgeoning nomad area, which is north of Madison Square Park. So if you're on Fifth Avenue and 30th Street, look up. You can't miss it. And consider visiting us in our sales gallery as well.
Good luck, Melissa. Good
Thank you.
luck with that. You know, real estate development is very dynamic. I think every day a new challenge arises. So I'd like to just give the audience a couple of real-life experiences and what are some of your pressure points that you guys experience as you orchestrate through these multi-year transformational projects. So everyone's nodding. And who wants to start? I could pick.
Principal can pick.
Rebecca. Don't pick me. Don't pick me.
All right, I'll try to keep it short. I guess pressure points. Well, I'm actually in the Min one right now, which is our project in Glen Cove and Garvey's Point, which is a long time in coming and really exciting because it's actually out of the ground, and we're topping out on some of our residential buildings. We're trying to close a loan with Goldman, and I think she might still be here. I need to see her afterwards because we're going to close it. But it's one of this particular pressure point. I think it happens with anyone who's been through a big project. There's the moment where you're like, we're all the way through, we are fully pregnant, right? We're building, this thing is gonna open when it needs to open, and is it gonna work, And the dream is there, the vision is there, we've done all of the diligence, right? We're building, but there's that moment where, and it happened on Barclays Center, it's happened in the Coliseum, where you say, oh my God, what if this opens and everyone hates it? What if it gets a terrible architectural review? What if nobody comes and rents the apartments? And it's just that it actually makes the success of the project so much more enjoyable. But I would say that is a major pressure point, the moment of doubt before it actually happens.
Okay, hey, Meg?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many pressure points. I mean, but I guess for me, the most recent pressure point that I experienced is in a deal, especially if you're not if your company's not funding all of it, equity. There's in our case, in Nomad, we are the GP. We needed to find an equity partner, and we needed to find a lender. And that sounds kind of simple, but it really is fairly tricky, and this is also happening at a time when you're trying to get the GMP from the contractor, and they need our lenders need the GMP in order to issue the loan. Yet I don't really know exactly how much equity I needed until we know what level of debt I can get. So there was, am I going to get 60%? Am I going to get 65%? That actually swings the equity check quite a bit. And so it's constantly sort of juggling the various balls that are up in the air and communicating, and they all sort of relate. So, and we had a situation where we had a change of schedule, sort of the delivery schedule of our condo unit. So the TCOs, which we were supposed to have 3 TCOs sort of spanning from roughly 2 years from last September for a sort of 6 months period in 3 different chunks, and it got extended. So when that got extended, I'm sure that from the contractor's point of view, it's sort of like not that big of a deal, right? I mean, you guys are gonna get your condos, it's just gonna be 2 months late. And for me, it's a huge deal. It's like it totally blows up my pro forma. And there are all these business terms that I've already agreed to with the LPs in terms of sales milestones and all these milestones. Same with the lenders as well in terms of their milestones. And so it's so many things are all sort of intertwined in this mesh, and and it's almost a miracle that all these things come together, and that you can actually, and that we were able to close both debt and equity on the same exact date. And so that was like a huge pressure point for me, but that's behind me, thankfully.
I think it's like what development is, right? Our job at the end of the day is to make things happen. Yeah. And I think one of, our collective most incredible pressure points, several of us actually were working on Barclays Center many years ago. So imagine that you've got essentially, you're trying to finance Barclays Center. There's, the IRS has financing regulations that change, but they sunsetted your ability to use previous existing financing rules, but you have to essentially close on the financing by a specific date. Right, so you're managing to an end date, and as you're approaching that end date, you're pulling all the final pieces of the deal together. And some of the requirements in a public-private partnership, we had to, for example, provide letters of credit to the MTA for certain obligations, various parties. the pressure point comes down as the end. We're pulling all the different pieces together, and essentially you're having a letter of credit, several letters of credit being sent to deliver, and all of a sudden, essentially, 2 of the letters of credit in an envelope go missing. Where essentially it is right before the holidays, and they go missing, and you're trying to figure out how to close the deal, right? And you go through the process of trying to see if you can work with your public parties to see if they'll take a copy of the letter of credit. No, they won't take a copy of the credit card. Can you get the bank to issue a new letter of credit? The bank doesn't want to issue a new letter of credit without having the old one to cancel that they don't have 2 outstanding. So all of a sudden, then you have to essentially charter a plane to try to negotiate with one banker to approval of another letter of credit, while at the same time trying to call essentially the transportation company that was sending the letter of credits where they're lost, and trying to see if you can, right before Christmas, reopen a mail facility to have someone find the letter of credits, right? And all of this is happening. So you're organizing a private jet to go convince the banker, but where they issue the letter of credits is a different city from where they approve the issuance of letter of credit is different from where they actually issue the letter of credits. So you have to have 2 stops, right? And so then, in the meantime, you're setting all of that up, and in the process, you're trying to get a facility reopened, which you managed to do, and in the middle, right as you're about to have a private plane take off to try to get letters of credit reissued, you've gotten a facility reopened with workers looking for a letter of credit, identified someone who's been in the office on standby at the mail facility, calling, opening the document, says, I think we have it, and they come and deliver it to you right before the closing, before essentially the financing piece. I mean, it is the pressure points that we all deal with. That is, I think, what development is.
You could never come up with a list of everything that could happen because, and I've been in the business 35 years, and it's always something new. So we're about to wrap up, so I just want to do one quick question, and then we'll open up to Q&A. But if there was one piece of advice that you can give the people here in pursuing a career in development, what do you think it would be? We'll start with Kate, and then we'll go that way.
Yeah, I think the piece that I would the piece of advice I would give is the investment in time in the relationships with your colleagues and with people in the industry. I think as people enter the field, there's so much that we focus on proving ourselves and working hard and putting the time and investment in, which is incredibly important. But I think making sure you also create the time and building those relationships, I think that kind of bears fruit over the lifetime of your career.
Thanks, Kate.
Sure. A great early mentor of mine always had an expression, which is nature hates a vacuum. And I always thought it was such a wacky thing. I actually think it's nature abhors a vacuum. And what that's really how I thought about that and why I have kept this as a piece of advice to myself and to those that I mentor is don't wait for someone to ask you to do something. You need to be looking at what are the gaps in your business, what are the gaps in your project, and as a young person, your opportunity is about making yourself useful in where those gaps are. That advice was a huge part of what sort of drove my professional development, just figuring out what's the next challenge that no one was thinking about and starting to do work on that so that when all of a sudden everyone said, oh my God, what about X, Y, and Z, you at least were a leg up and had perspective to give to solving that problem. So think about where you can be useful before anyone else knows that they need you there.
Great. Okay.
I would say one word of advice is just to be very intentional and deliberate about all the decisions that you make. And as we know, development, there's like literally a million decisions that get made between when you acquire a site or even before you acquire a site to the last sales or the last unit that you're renting. And each one of those decisions is very important. And if you make them each intentionally and deliberately, especially in this very competitive environment that we're living in right now, I think that you will end up with a really good product. And I think that even in a competitive environment or even in a downturn, the product that sells are ones that really meet the demands of the customers. And so just be sort of mindful, deliberate, and intentional.
Okay, Rebecca?
So always be learning. every meeting you're in is an opportunity to learn. Do the work, because that's how you learn. And number 3, remember that the real estate world is small and memories are long. So you have to, sort of a riff on Kate's, building those relationships and how you interact with people on one particular project on one particular day. They will remember that about you for your whole career. And that can be a great advantage or a great disadvantage. So just always remember that.
Okay, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists? Okay.
First, thank you for the wonderful presentation and the speech. Actually, I have a question, but maybe not related to the environment, because as we all know, we actually facing global warming for the past 12 months. The temperature is rising much higher than the past 50 years in the incredible speed. That's a concern. It's very important, but it's not very urgent at this moment. And also we're facing like water crisis, energy, all this crisis. So I wonder, as a developer, that you will facing all these choices can be environmental conscious decision when you develop the building. Because nowadays the building in the future probably co-living, co-working, all this intertwined in one building. And in this building, we probably need to think about something, maybe saving the water, saving the energy, keep the temperature down, like all this LEED, what we have the certificate, the meaning of the certificate about the LEED building. But in day-to-day operation, probably not going to achieve that much energy saving. So between this high cost to have energy and environmental saving, and the development, because as investor always look for return, right? So there's a conflict definitely in between. So how do you see the conflict? And how do we, as I know one of the keynote speakers says, the building lasts for more than 100 years. Our body will perish, but the building will last forever, like not like forever, but very, very long time. So how do you see this conflict to building the next generation and next generation the benefit for the building? Thank you.
Okay, I want to take that.
Sure, I can take that. Sustainability and environmental resiliency is a huge part of the development conversation. We didn't get a chance to really touch on that up here, but that from a design and a planning and even a competitive positioning standpoint is something that we think a lot about. In particular at Lend-Lease, we're developing in gateway cities around the world. A lot of those are immediately adjacent to, coastal cities or to major bodies of water. So we think a lot about, long-term impact of sea level change. In particular, when we go through our investment process, we have a social and environmental mandate on each one of the projects that we undertake. And it's really indicative for each one of the teams on a project-by-project basis to figure out what they're going to do, not only to sort of address, the basics, that's, table stakes, but what are we doing to really differentiate ourselves in the, environmental equation? Because I think that whether it's an office tenant looking at how they have, backup power, they can't be off the grid, they can never be down, to, a residential purchaser thinking about, what is the value of their asset going to be in 50 years, since, they're going to be living there for 50 years, and what do they need to see as infrastructure into the project to really be equipped to, have the enjoyment of their home over that lifespan. These are questions that we think about as we're going through our investment and acquisitions process. So they're not afterthoughts, they're very intentional. And I think specifically to your point about LEED, I think what's exciting about how the conversation is really involved in the development space is that it's really moved beyond LEED to really being about, occupants, and not so much about building science, which is interesting and important, but about what is, a certain environmental measure do for the quality of life of occupants, whether those be, office or residential.
And I would say, jump in, I think it's kind of triangulating with respect to there's long-term landowners, and then there's also tenants, particularly in the commercial space, that are asking you the questions of What about the resiliency? How is this building going to survive as we deal with different issues? And I think that as both kind of tenants ask questions and long-term landowners ask questions, that is driving an investment that helps create essentially more of a market norm. And I think it gets integrated more and more as technology advances, right? As there's more, whether it be smart buildings and integration of sensors and efficiency of energy, and those are really good and beneficial pieces for this overall sustainability practice. I think that we're going in a direction where things are triangulating in a positive direction.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you all, and thank you guys for joining the panel today.
Great.